something that comes up very often is that people get into analysis paralysis because there are so many different frameworks and options. And do you have any tips on how people can find the right framework for them?
I usually recommend when people ask me this that if their goal is to land a job at a company to
Welcome to the Coding in Flow podcast. My name is Florian Walter, and in this show I interview interesting people from the programming industry to learn from them about software engineering, career development, and life in general. In this episode I will be talking to a Jessica Chan, aka the Coder, who is a self-taught web developer and YouTuber. And I noticed Jessica because she makes these really amazing high quality explainer videos on YouTube that look like something you would see in a cinema normally. Yeah, really amazing. And besides that, she also makes regular web development tutorials. And what I found really interesting is that she has a very similar backstory as I have. She first got in touch with programming in high school, but she did not pursue this as a career right away. She did not study computer science in university, and I also didn't study computer science. And we both really started getting into programming in our late 20s. So pretty late compared to many other people, but nevertheless she managed to teach herself web development and eventually land a job with a six-figure salary. And if you're also planning to teach yourself web development and eventually land a job, you should absolutely watch this episode. It will be super interesting. Jessica will lay out a general roadmap with an overview of topics and technologies you have to learn to get into web development. She will also explain the difference between front-end and back-end. And we will cover some more meta topics like how to learn properly, which is of course important if you're self-taught, how to cope with stuff like imposter syndrome or analysis paralysis when there are just too many technologies and you can't decide which one to learn first. We will talk about all this stuff. It's super interesting, so lean back and enjoy the show. Okay, so I like to start the episode with the guests saying a few words about their personal life, how much you're comfortable with sharing. Maybe you can tell us how you got into programming and what you like about programming. Because what I saw from researching a little bit about you is that we have a pretty similar history. You also started programming pretty late, in your late 20s, and it was actually the same for me. And yeah, maybe you can give us a quick summary about your pathway into programming.
Yeah, for sure. So I did not study computer science or anything in school. I actually studied photography. And after college, I just didn't really know what I wanted to do. But eventually, I randomly got this job for data entry. And they ended up teaching me some backend programming and database stuff for SQL. And I basically worked there for 2 years. I kind of learned some of the I learned backend, some .NET stuff. And after that, I was able to apply for and land an actual formal web developer job at an advertising agency. And I worked at the agency for 6 years, and I basically learned just so much there. Just a lot more front end. I had taught myself some basic HTML and CSS when I was younger, but obviously it was not as much as what I needed for at the advertising agency job. But yeah, so I worked there for a long time. I learned all my skills that I have now there, I think. And so now I'm just kind of doing YouTube.
You do a YouTube full-time now, right?
It's full-time.
Okay.
I have not replaced my developer income, but I think I'm hoping to sort of grow into that.
As I already mentioned, my history in programming was pretty similar. I also started in my late 20s. And before that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I studied business economics, but I never did work with that in any way. And yeah, in a video, you mentioned that you had some phases of not being really motivated in your early 20s and not really knowing what you should do. And yeah, I know this feeling very well. It was the same for me. And it's always good to see that people can still become successful in these careers, even if they don't start out the typical or the perfect way, like 30 years old, you get your first programming book and then it was your passion all your life. This is not always how it works out, right? Sometimes people need a while to really find their way into programming or whatever they want to do. So it's always good to see other people that have a similar background. And I thought maybe we can summarize a few tips for people who are self-taught programmers. I want to talk a bit more specifically about web development later, but some general tips for self-taught programmers, because I know that you already gave some tips in one of your videos. For example, learning to Google. That's important, right? You should learn how to use Google and how to come up with solutions yourself. And from the top of your head, do you have some more ideas in mind, some more tips that people can follow when they want to teach themselves programming?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that is pretty important when you're trying to teach yourself coding is to not get overwhelmed, because there's so much to learn in web development and any kind of programming, really. And so I think that I get a lot of comments from people just asking, what do I have to learn first? And so, because I think when you start trying to learn yourself, you just don't know like what you should start to learn first. Like, do you need to learn like multiple programming languages, like all kinds of different like frameworks and stuff like that. So I just sort of tell people to start with the basics, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because that's what ends up being loaded in your web browser. So those are kind of the fundamentals of the internet.
You are also a fan of, I heard you mention the term active learning. So learning by doing, basically. That's important, right? You should not passively, just passively watch tutorials, because I have absolutely the same opinion. Not only is it more effective, but it's also more fun, in my opinion, to actually try to build something and not just watch tutorials and follow the instructions step by step. You also mentioned in the video that you had problems with imposter syndrome in your first jobs. This is also very typical. What's your experience with that? Do you still have imposter syndrome, and how did you cope with that, and how bad actually was it? Do you actually still feel like an imposter, or do you feel comfortable now in your career?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I will probably struggle with imposter syndrome in some form or another for, the rest of my life. I think just because that's part of the nature of being human, or at least for me it is. But it was, the imposter syndrome was very difficult and, a lot when I first started out, just because I was working with people who'd gotten bachelor's degrees and master's degrees in computer science. I had not, obviously. And so I almost felt like, not that they'd made a mistake hiring me, but I felt like I'd somehow maybe tricked them or fooled them into thinking I would be a good hire, when in reality, maybe I wasn't. But that got a lot better over time, just as I learned and got more confidence as I was getting better at building websites. And so I think the imposter syndrome was more manageable, I think, maybe starting 2 years or so in. And I think now I do still have it, just because I don't know everything, but one person can't be expected to know 100% of everything in the field. So I think it's just kind of a matter of trying to do the best I can, making sure I do as much research as I can when I'm making YouTube videos, because I don't want to make a video teaching something that's inaccurate. It's probably my worst nightmare, but I think it's just a matter of trying to do the best you can and knowing that things will get better over time. I am actually planning on making a video about imposter syndrome sometime in the future. So
yeah, I think it's a good idea to make a video about that, because the more you talk about this topic, the more people realize that it's very common, and the less they actually suffer under that. And by now, so many people have talked about this, and so many successful people, that, I mean, just Googling about imposter syndrome should give you an idea of that it's really common, and that it's kind of an illusion, because we all figure it out along the way. And even the people I know who studied computer science, they say that most of the stuff they learned by themselves and not actually in their computer science studies, because it's a lot of theory. But the stuff that you really apply on the job has nothing, or has not much to do with that. I guess in programming, everyone is self-taught in some way. what I really like about your YouTube channel in particular is that you make these really extremely high quality videos that really feel like watching some kind of TV. I don't know, TV commercial. It's even more. It even looks better than a TV commercial, or not a commercial. Maybe a documentary is probably the right word. You have these really advanced animations, and I don't even know how to explain it. For example, you have a video where you talk about your programming history, and you made it up like you made it look like some kind of video game, right? Where you are the character and you move to these different places. Absolutely amazing. And I will put some links to these videos into the show notes so people can check them out. Maybe we can just briefly touch on that. How do you make these very amazing videos? You have help for that, right?
Yeah, thank you. I do have help. So my husband is a video editor and animator. He's very experienced and he's obviously very creative. But anything in my videos that is creative or looks cool is because of him. So I definitely lucked out in that area. But yeah, for that video that you were talking about, he designed and animated the 8-bit style animations. And he's really good about coming up with just really creative ideas for how to talk about different subjects that I would never have imagined. So it's worked out really well. And yeah, I'm just glad that, thank you for watching the videos, and I'm glad they can sort of entertain people while also educating.
Yeah, some of these are really popping off and get a lot of views, right? So they have really this higher virality potential, probably because of how well they are made and all the information in there. I mean, you also have a web development roadmap which covers so much stuff, and it looks so nice. And again, I will put this into the show notes. We can talk about web development in particular in a few minutes. I just want to touch a bit more on the videos. How do you think about, when you make YouTube videos, quality versus quantity? Because you lean very heavily towards quality, right? When you make these videos, the trade-off is always, should I release less videos if I'm a YouTuber and make them really high quality? Or should I edit them less and put a bit less effort into them but release more videos? How do you think about this? Is this something you are actively thinking about and maybe struggling with? Or do you just say, okay, quality all the way is the way to go? Or have you ever thought about making more videos but with a little bit lower quality?
Yeah, it's definitely, I definitely struggle with that a lot, because I think there's this default feeling that I should upload something every single week, at least one video per week, right? I think that's kind of what a lot of YouTubers try to do. But I think I like that roadmap video that you mentioned. It kind of went viral last summer. And I actually didn't upload anything after that video. I didn't upload anything for about 3 months, but it was still getting a lot of views. And so that sort of taught me that I don't need to feel obligated to get on this like hamster wheel of trying to upload a video every week. So I definitely err more onto the quality side of things versus quantity. But at the same time, I think if I waited, 2 months between every video, I think that wouldn't really help my audience, since, the content that I create is kind of educational and like I'm trying to help people learn web development and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I think everyone just, if you're a YouTuber, you just kind of need to find the balance that works for you, that you can still create content, but you're not feeling overly stressed about meeting some kind of frequency schedule. And so that's just what I try to do for myself. So I would like to upload one video per week, but if I don't, I try not to worry about it too much. Because I do think YouTube is pretty forgiving in its algorithm, even if you don't upload every single week, unlike other platforms like Instagram and things like that, where I think they really try to get you to create more regular content. So that's kind of how I deal with it.
Yeah, do you know from the top of your head how many videos you have in your channel?
My channel total?
Yeah, total amount of videos.
I have maybe 40 videos at this point or
Yeah,
so.
yeah, so we are really opposite in this regard, I think, because I have many videos, a few hundred, that all don't bring in many views per video, but they're the mass. Is what makes up the total views per month. And you mentioned the hamster wheel, and it can really turn into a hamster wheel. There are a lot of tech YouTubers that kind of burn out from making videos, right? It's not as much fun as it looks sometimes. Do you enjoy making videos all the time, or did you have any problems with burnout and stuff like that? Especially since you said you have a really high bar with your videos because they are so good and they get so many views. And this can be how's it called? A curse and what's the opposite of a curse? What?
Blessing.
Oh yeah, right. A blessing and a curse at the same time because the video itself is successful, but setting yourself such a high bar can become difficult when you make the next video, right? Did you have any trouble with that?
Yeah.
Any sense of burnout or something like that?
So far, luckily, I personally haven't really felt burned out, and I hope to avoid that, indefinitely. But we'll see. But yeah, there is a sense of like, oh, we like set the bar like pretty high the last video. For the next video, we need to make sure it's like equal or maybe above. So there is that pressure. I think that I try to deal with that by like focusing on the value that I can give viewers, even if the production value isn't super high. I can still give people helpful information for themselves. But yeah, it's a lot of there's a lot of competing pressures, I think, when creating YouTube videos and trying to balance your own life. It's like the work-life balance kind of thing.
Yeah, for me it has been super difficult. I used to make only tutorials, basically screen recording, but I did kind of burn out doing that. It's really difficult over time. And this is one reason why I've experimented with some other kinds of videos, like this podcast here, for example, because it's a different kind of video and it's just fun to have some variation from the usual stuff.
Yeah.
And okay, now we can talk a bit more about web development. So I already mentioned your roadmap video, which is a good overview about all the stuff you need and the things you have to learn to get into web development. And you summarize what these different things are. And as I already said, I will put this into the show notes. This will be the video description here on YouTube. And later when I upload the audio version of this podcast, it will be the show notes, the caption. And are you able to, from the top of your head, summarize a few points from this video? So the general overview of topics people have to learn in order to get into web development. And you don't have to be very detailed, just a general overview.
Yeah, for sure. So I made this roadmap because I had seen other roadmaps out there that are very comprehensive and cover like pretty much every single possible technology and skill you would need. And I personally, even as a professional web developer, found that a little bit overwhelming. And so I wanted to make a simpler one that I felt would be a little bit more beginner friendly. I think those other roadmaps are awesome and definitely useful as a reference. But for me, the basic steps of learning web development are learning the basics, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because that's what ends up being loaded in your browser. And then learning some of the tools that are pretty useful. So things like NPM, Node Package Manager, build tools like I like using Gulp, but there's things like Webpack, Parcel, things like that. And then also version control. So Git and GitHub. Those are super useful and you definitely a must know. So then after the basics and the tools, I also cover like it's good to learn Sass, which is a CSS preprocessor, and also responsive design principles. And then if you want to, after you've learned JavaScript, the basics, you can learn a JavaScript framework. So like React, Vue, etc. And then the last part is for the backend side. So it's like, the server side, like database stuff, as well as programming languages. So, that could be Node if you want to do the JavaScript thing, or, languages like Java, PHP, Ruby, Python, etc. So those are the basic areas for web development.
Okay, and for people who don't know the difference between front end and back end, can you maybe quickly summarize what the difference between these two is front end and back end development, and maybe which one you prefer and how people can find their own preference for. I guess they have to try it out, right? But yeah, maybe you can summarize what front end and back end means.
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. So I usually think about front end as what you see on the website. So a lot of that would be the design, and that would entail, learning CSS, Sass, responsive design to make sure the design is accurately reflected on the website. And then things like JavaScript. So if there's a dynamic aspect to your website, like submitting a form or loading data from the backend, which I guess I'll get to in a sec, to the actual website display, that would be considered front end. Back end is more of the sort of like behind the scenes logic type of things that you may not notice right away. So things like the database, if you're loading data onto the website, things like programming logic, which could handle a lot of things like the form submission. And if you have like a sort of complex app, that could use backend programming as well. Obviously nowadays it's a little bit, there's like Jamstack where it's all like sort of static and you get data not from a database but from an API, so that you can load things just with like JavaScript API and then markup. So things are changing a bit, but I actually started my career doing backend stuff. So I did a lot of database and .NET programming, and I like that. I think you might like it, you being the viewer. People might like backend programming if they like the idea of like figuring out the logic and working with data and stuff, and that is actually pretty fun. But later in my career, I started focusing more on the front end, specifically building these front end layouts using Sass and CSS and a little bit of JavaScript or jQuery, which I had to do at my job. And I think they're definitely very different. I've worked with programmers who only wanted to do backend and they did not want to mess with like CSS and stuff like that, which is perfectly fine. I personally really like the challenge of trying to replicate a design on the website, and just doing that. So yeah, I think, as you said, I think if you're learning web development and you're trying to pick between front and back end, I would just suggest trying both and seeing which one sort of resonates with you a little bit more.
Yeah, so just try it out and see for yourself. I also think I would enjoy backend more. So what I've done is I usually do Android development most of the time. For an app, I've written my own, or at least I've tried to, it's not production ready yet, but my own REST API. And this is then backend development, right? And yeah, for me personally, I find this more interesting than trying to design how a website actually looks. But I guess it's up to personal preference. Do you have any own courses or any affiliation with courses that you can recommend to people?
Right now I'm working on a course called Responsive Design for Beginners. It's not out yet, and I continually feel guilty that it's not launched yet, but I'm hoping to launch it maybe at the end of the year, like in December or something like that.
Yeah, do you already have maybe a landing page or an email list for that?
Yeah.
Okay, then I
Yeah,
will
I
put
do.
a link to that into the show notes as well. And
Awesome. Thank you.
are there any other sources you can recommend for learning web development, or is it just typing whatever you want to know into Google? Or do you have any recommendations for good beginner courses on web development?
Yeah. So I highly recommend freecodecamp.org, because they're free. They cover full stack. I think they just added a data science area as well. And they're great because if you're not sure if you're ready to commit, to paying money for something, then you can just try it out and see if you like web development at all. I think it's mostly text-based. They do have a YouTube channel, but their curriculum itself is not like video-based. I know that some people really like learning from videos, like myself included. But they're a great place to start. Other than that, there's obviously a lot of content on YouTube that you can just type into the search bar and look for YouTube channels. And then I do recommend, if you're serious about it, I think it can be helpful to find a paid course that also includes a community. So this isn't paid, but Frontend Mentor is I guess, website or web app. They are a great place to practice. Frontendmentor.io. They have a lot of designs that you can use if you're practicing, the sort of design to web thing. And they have a Slack community where you can ask questions. So I think things like that are super helpful. Another place I would recommend learning from is zerotomastery.io. So it's this guy, Andre, I can't remember his last name, Nagoy, but he's a Udemy instructor, but then he recently launched his own platform where you can see all his courses it's like a monthly subscription kind of thing, but he also has like a Discord community. So I think if you're learning by yourself, it can be very difficult if you don't have people you can ask questions to when you get stuck, because that's kind of inevitable, right? So yeah, I would just recommend trying to find a good curriculum that you like the instructor, and then also if they have a community that can be super helpful for you.
Okay, nice. Thank you for the list. Again, I will put these links into the show notes. Yeah, and I've also asked the community about what questions they have about web development, and something that comes up very often is that people get into analysis paralysis because there are so many different frameworks and options. And do you have any tips on how people can find the right framework for them? Or should they just try something out and stick with it? Or should they try out different frameworks? Or are there any specific frameworks that are just much better than others? What is your view on this? How can people find the right frameworks and tools for them when they want to do web development?
Yeah, that's a great question because that is such a common thing. I usually recommend when people ask me this that if their goal is to land a job at a company, to try to do some research into what jobs are available to them and see what frameworks or programming languages or things like that seem to be the most common. So for example, in the JavaScript frameworks, I would say React is probably the most popular by volume. So that if you decide to learn React versus Vue or Angular, I think it's hard to go wrong just because it's so everywhere. But other than that, I think the most important thing is to just try to learn one thing to a certain level of proficiency, because let's say you start out and you learn Vue. I think after learning that, it's more easy for you to switch over to another framework like React or Angular if you have to for a job. So it's kind of like when you learn one thing to a certain level, you kind of understand the principles behind it, and then it's easier to learn something else. I think the same thing is true for programming languages. Like if you learn one language, then it's a little bit easier to pick up the other one because a lot of it is just syntax differences.
Yeah, and it's similar in Android development, where people always ask if they should start with Java or Kotlin. And the answer is it doesn't really matter, because if you learn Java, then you will pick up Kotlin very quickly. And it's the same with frameworks. And usually when you understand one of them, then you have a relatively easy time getting into another one. So people should usually not overthink this. I think this is the only mistake you can really make, is overthinking it and postponing it all the time. Just pick one and go with that. And also the community mentioned that they have a lot of trouble with CSS. I have played around with CSS a little bit on my website, but what's up with that? Is CSS so difficult? And if yes, do you have any tips for people to better learn CSS?
Yeah, CSS is, especially if you're coming from like the programming side, it can be extremely confusing, frustrating, rage-inducing, just because it does things that don't make sense, right? So I think it's not a programming language, but it definitely has its own like quirks and way it works. So it is possible to learn CSS and feel comfortable that you understand what's going on, even if something weird happens. But that still happens to me where I'm like, oh, why is this not working? And it takes me like hours to figure it out. So, don't feel bad if you get stuck on weird CSS stuff, because that happens a lot. But in terms of learning it, I think, just trying to find a course. I think on YouTube, Kevin Powell has a lot of excellent content covering a ton of different topics in CSS. And he's really good at explaining things as well. So he's I'd recommend checking him out on YouTube. And then just trying to practice, because I think, like you said earlier, it's like the active learning thing. You learn really well when you actually try to build stuff and figure out where things aren't working. And then that kind of tells you what areas you need to sort of learn or do a little bit of research on. But yeah, CSS can be very difficult. I think there's actually, not to just keep mentioning courses, but Josh Kumo, he has a course, CSS for JavaScript developers, and it's specifically aimed at if you're already like a programmer and a developer, but you just need to get better at CSS. It's kind of aimed at that. And I think his course is really awesome. I haven't gone through it myself, but just from the snippets that he shared on his Twitter and stuff, it seems to be really helpful for people.
Okay, that's a nice list. And Android development is really notorious for changing relatively fast, and stuff is getting deprecated all the time, so much that it turned into some kind of meme, Android and deprecation, because we always learn stuff and then it's deprecated a bit later. It's not actually that bad as people make it. But how is it in web development? It feels like web development has a bit more longevity when it comes to these tools. Maybe that's not the case at all. Do you feel like in web development stuff is changing very fast and you have to relearn all the time? Or can you actually work with the stuff you have learned years ago? I guess the basics like HTML and stuff like that stay pretty similar. But when it comes to these other frameworks and tools you have to use, do you feel like web development is a fast changing field, or does it feel relatively stable?
I think it had a ton of change back when the JavaScript frameworks were first kind of coming out. It was like Angular and React and then Vue. This is quite a while ago now. I don't remember what year they actually came out, but so just to preface, like, I don't really do a ton of JavaScript stuff, and that's where I think most of the changes are happening. Just with like React, and then there's like, I don't know, Next.js, and then now there's Svelte, which is like a new framework, and it does seem like there's a lot of change, but at the same time, I think there's still basics, and like, I think that you can still learn, JavaScript. Vanilla JavaScript is still very important to learn. And then on top of that, you can sort of choose whatever framework you want, like React or whatever, and then whatever things on top of that. So I think that it does feel like there's a lot of new stuff popping up all the time, but you can always kind of stick with the things that seem to be most popular, which is kind of what I do. Like, I don't personally try to learn everything that's on the cutting edge. So for example, in CSS, there's a lot of changes coming up right now that aren't, they're just kind of getting added to the specifications of CSS. So like CSS container queries and different like new like at rules and media query type stuff. And I haven't really gone into them too much just because they're not really widely available. But I think it's great, if you do want to learn that. I think some people enjoy being on the cutting edge, but I think it's definitely possible to not be on the cutting edge and still be okay, as long as you learn the things that have been already sort of more mainstreamed and stuff.
Okay, and for someone who gets into web development, how is the freelancing job market? Is it easy to get freelance jobs as a web developer, and how are the hourly rates? I guess I want to ask, is it easy to make money as a freelancer in web development?
It's definitely possible. I have contracted in the past, but it's always been for previous employers. So I personally never had to, like go out and try to find clients and stuff like that. But I do think it's possible just from my own experience. Like, when I tell people that I'm a web developer, invariably a lot of them will be like, oh, I like need a website like for my business or what have you, or I know my brother needs a website. So I feel like, especially with small businesses, they all need websites. And so I think it is very possible to make a good money from freelancing, and just building. You can start by building websites for small businesses that you know, or even just start with like making websites for family members and kind of learn from there. I'm not super, I don't know if I'm the most qualified person to give freelancing advice, but some people that I know are more experts in freelancing there's this guy, John Morris, online. He has a YouTube channel, but he also has courses on, I believe, Skillshare. And he was one of the first people that I found when I was initially considering doing freelancing web development and quitting my job and stuff like that. And I think there's another person, Study Web Development, and I think he just released a course with Brad Traversy about freelancing. So there are resources out there that if you want to learn about it, you can. I will say that if you're doing freelancing for small businesses, you might need to learn things like WordPress or Shopify, just these e-commerce kinds of things that are really important for small businesses. So it's definitely possible.
Yeah, WordPress is also what I use to build my website, but it's not a very special site. It's just so people can find out more information. But yeah, I mean, in web development, what's the view on WordPress? Is it kind of looked down upon because it's so simple? Yeah, what's the general review, I guess, that web developers have about WordPress?
There's definitely a lot of WordPress, looking down on WordPress and PHP too. But I actually use WordPress in my own blog, and I think it's great. I think that, I'm not sure, I actually don't know why people don't like it. Actually, no, I do know why people don't like it. It can be very like confusing and frustrating, trying to like, I don't know, edit the PHP and stuff like that. But I think it's gotten better over time. And WordPress is used in like 70 something percent of websites. And it's just really easy to create a website with WordPress if you're working for a client, as opposed to like if you work for a client and you build on this custom website with, I'm not sure what, like Hugo or some other static framework or whatever, like it can work, but then like what happens when someone else has to take over the project? The benefit of using WordPress and Squarespace and website builders like that is that you can, if you know WordPress, you can work on any WordPress site. And so it's just kind of like this standard that is, one, easier for the client to edit because it's a CMS, and then two, because it's so common, that you can easily pick up other WordPress sites and stuff like that. So I personally think that WordPress, I understand why it gets hate, but I think it's just so everywhere that you can't not learn it, honestly, especially if you're doing freelance stuff.
Yeah, what I liked about WordPress so much is that it's easy to get started with, even if you don't have any web development experience at all. You can just install it, and then it's like a little blog tool. If you don't do anything special with it, it's like a blog website almost, where you can create posts and they will be viewed in the correct places, and you can pick a ready-made theme, and it's very easy to get a simple blog started. But you can also kind of dig deeper and change more stuff and actually write code and change the CSS and everything, and you can make it more customized and give it more functionality. But the problem with WordPress seems to be that the more functionality you add to it, at least via plugins, the more hackable it gets, right? So I was told by a lot of people that I should put as little or as few plugins in there as possible. Is that really a problem? Do WordPress sites get hacked often? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think they're very big targets for hacking because it's so prevalent. So yeah, the advice of trying to install as few plugins as possible is very good, just because I think one of the main security risks for WordPress sites is not keeping your plugins and themes and stuff up to date, because often they get hacked and stuff, and so then the plugin authors have to, write a fix for that. And so if you don't update your plugins, then your site's going to be, open to attack. So yeah, I definitely try to use as few plugins as possible. And I think that helps. At least, I don't know. I haven't gotten hacked yet.
Yeah, I had a time where I had like 60 or over 60 plugins installed, but I didn't get hacked either. But I made sure to uninstall some of them later. But what I've been wondering about, what if you have a website and you want to add more and more functionality to it, like maybe a forum, a community board, and then the community board itself needs additional plugins for, I don't know, uploading files and adding advertisement and stuff like that, and user profiles and maybe social media functionality between the people. When I tried to build something like this, I had to add more and more plugins, and then I easily ended up with a lot of them. So what should I do if I want to build a website like this? Should I just avoid WordPress at all and code it all by myself, or how do you do that without creating something that is very easily hackable? I guess you have to code it yourself from scratch.
Yeah, I think it's hard to know what the best solution to do in that circumstances. But yeah, I think that can be one benefit of learning, PHP and then being able to do some custom code, which could also create more problems in itself, right? I think the other option could be instead of trying to code your own forum, using like an existing solution. So like, you could create a Discord community or use Patreon for members only stuff, and just kind of use those tools as opposed to trying to build your own. Obviously, if you need something very custom, then there might not be an existing solution that works for you. But I think my personal point of view is I try to not take on too much of the technical stuff myself if there's a better solution out there, just so I can focus on the things that are more important to me, like, creating content and stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, that's what I ended up doing as well. I had this idea of creating a forum, but I scratched that idea and just created Discord server instead, because then I don't have to take care of making this secure and everything. And it's just easier. And yeah, I've moved most of my stuff. In the past, I had all my YouTube videos nicely lined out on my website with the code and everything, but this always caused more and more problems, and I ending up removing the stuff and just putting the code directly on GitHub and keeping the videos only on YouTube, because this way it's just easier. But yeah, I guess the better you are in writing your own web dev code, the more options you have to build your customized stuff. And in web development, what are the common IDEs you use, or what's the IDE you use and you prefer?
I use VS Code just because it's free. So I think it's definitely the most commonly used one right now, at least for people I've seen. So yeah, I love VS Code. Obviously, there's a lot of other IDEs out there. I know some people really like Vim and Atomic. I think that's another one. JetBrains, WebStorm.
Yeah, they have.
But yeah, I don't know. I like VS Code.
Yeah, up until recently, I actually didn't realize that Visual Studio and VS Code are not the same IDE, right? VS Code is like a lightweight version of that.
Yeah.
And when I then tried out a little bit of Unity game development, then I actually needed the real Visual Studio with all the heavier features. And I noticed recently that there is this new GitHub feature where you can actually use VS Code directly in the browser. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, I haven't looked into that too much, but yeah, I saw that come out recently, and it's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, I think you will go to a GitHub repository and you just press on the period button on your keyboard, and then it opens VS Code right in the browser. It's pretty mind-blowing the first time. Yeah, so people can try this out. And I actually did not note down any more questions. It's a relatively short episode, but do you have anything else you wanted to add? Maybe any important topic that we didn't cover here?
I can't really think of any
Yeah, me neither.
additional ones.
Yeah, I think it's a good summary for people to get started with web development. And again, they should check out all the links that you mentioned that I will put into the show notes. And yeah, then the last question is, where can people find out more about you if they want to connect with you? What sites can they find you on besides your YouTube channel?
Yeah, so other than my YouTube channel, Coder, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at the Coder for both of them. And then I have a blog, coder-coder.com. So those are the main places to find me at.
Yeah, now you reminded me of one more question I wanted to ask, but I
Yeah.
already asked it somewhere else. What's up with the name Coder? Does this have any special any special meaning, or is this just I don't know? Is this just 2 times the words coder basically appended?
Yeah, I don't know. When I was trying to think of names for like the channel, I went through this really long list. But again, my husband came up with Coder, and I liked it because you could try to say a meaning as like I teach people how to code, so I'm like trying to help coding coders. But it's mostly, I think, just the 2-word thing. It makes it a little bit more memorable. Yeah.
Yeah, it's catchy, so I guess it works. Okay, then yeah, that's basically it. Then I thank you for coming up in the show and talking about web development with us, and goodbye.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Coding in Flow podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from. If you're watching this on YouTube, please also leave a like on this video and also leave a comment with any suggestions, any input, your opinion on the topics we have talked about in this episode, anything. I actually read all of these comments. If you listen to this on Apple Podcast, please leave a 5-star rating if you think this show deserves it. My name is Florian Walter, and you can find me on most social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, anywhere, under the handle @codinginflow, just one word, codinginflow. And you can also join our free Discord community, which is a really nice chat with now thousands of developers, where you can discuss programming topics, even off-topic stuff, whatever you want to talk about. It's a really nice place to get help from, and you can find this community under codinginflow.com/discord. Then I thank you again for watching this episode, and I hope I see you again in the next one. Take care.